boys that are strictly platonic, but diamonds are a girl. Must give was Sonic a better bets. And youth is
There are
gone,
mysteries that
and you
history
can't
buries.
straighten up.
And then there is Marilyn Monroe, the woman who refused to stay dead. To the public, she was the eternal blonde dream. To the people who saw her that final night, she was something else entirely. At 3 a.m., Sergeant Jack Clemens of the LAPD was the first to arrive at her Brentwood home. He later said, "It looked staged, too clean, too quiet, like death had been rehearsed." On the bedside table, empty pill bottles lined with impossible precision. On the floor, a phone, still off the hook, as if she had been trying to make one last call. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, swore he broke the bedroom window to reach her. But the housekeeper, Eunice Murray, told a different story, one that changed every time she spoke. And somewhere between those conflicting words, the truth started to rot. Her friends in Hollywood whispered that she'd been frightened not of fame, but of the men behind it. A bodyguard who once worked for her claimed she had begged to disappear. The coroner's assistant said the autopsy report was incomplete. The journalist who covered the story admitted decades later that key evidence had been redirected before it ever saw daylight. Every voice pointed in a different direction. Every detail contradicted the next. Yet somehow, all roads led to the same conclusion: Marilyn Monroe didn't die because she was weak. She died because she knew too much. And when you listen to the fragments, the officer's suspicion, the doctor's denial, the maid's trembling, lies a pattern emerges. Hollywood's most luminous star was never allowed to fade. She was extinguished. Before she was a corpse on a cold Brentwood floor, she was America's dream, wrapped in satin, the shimmering illusion that desire could be bottled, sold, and photographed from every angle. Her name wasn't even real. Norma Jean Mortensen became Marilyn Monroe, and the transformation was not rebirth but surgery, a dissection of identity done under the bright light of a studio, not a hospital. In the 1,950 seconds, Hollywood didn't create stars. It manufactured obedience. Every smile, every hair strand, every blink was rehearsed. And in that system, Marilyn was their most perfect product, the woman who could make loneliness look erotic. Studio executive Daryl Zanuck once said privately, "She doesn't act. She absorbs the camera like a wound." To her press agent, she was a miracle, a walking advertisement for every dream America ever sold itself. "It is having to ten charge o bring a flongage." To the journalist, she was soft gold, a headline generator whose heartbreaks sold more papers than her films did tickets. To her psychiatrist, she was a child trapped in the body of the world's most desired woman. And to herself, she once wrote in her notebook, "Fame doesn't heal anything. It just hides the wounds better." 7. She was chased by men who wanted to save her, own her, or silence her. John Huston, who directed her first major film, said, "She had the saddest eyes I'd ever seen. You'd think she was staring into her own future." Behind closed doors, the studio system fed her pills to wake her up, pills to put her to sleep, pills to keep her smiling, the pharmacology of control. By the time she reached 30, she wasn't living a life. She was maintaining an image. When journalists described her home as a dollhouse of perfection, they didn't mention that she slept with the lights on, terrified of the dark. Her bodyguard later recalled seeing her rehearse laughter in the mirror before public appearances, not out of vanity, but fear of disappointing the world's fantasy. Each time she walked onto a red carpet, you could almost hear the machinery of manipulation behind her: managers, producers, doctors, lovers, all tightening their grip. To the tabloids, she was the untouchable goddess. To the people inside her orbit, she was the most touchable thing in the world, and that was the problem. A producer once bragged, "She didn't know how to say no." That's what made her irresistible. But to those who truly saw her, Marilyn's tragedy wasn't in being used. It was in realizing she had become complicit in her own exploitation. As the 1,960 seconds loomed, the tone shifted. Her fame was still vast, but her control was evaporating. She began missing shoots, canceling press events, rejecting studio contracts that felt like golden cages. Her psychiatrist warned, "She's on the verge of collapse, emotional, not physical." The studio called her difficult. The press called her unstable. And the men she trusted most began to turn cold. And yet in all her chaos, Marilyn was quietly plotting something no one expected: independence. She had just formed her own production company, unheard of for a woman at the time, and was preparing to expose the hypocrisy of the industry that had built her. But power never forgives rebellion, especially when rebellion comes dressed in diamonds and breathes like a secret. In those final months, the walls were closing in. Studio executives, political figures, secret lovers, and federal agents all circling the same fragile woman. To some, she was a liability. To others, a ticking bomb. And in the end, the only thing more dangerous than what she knew was who she could tell. Because by then, Marilyn Monroe wasn't just an actress. She was a witness. Long before the diamonds, before the white dress caught the wind of the subway grate, there was a little girl with tangled hair and too many last names. Her birth certificate said Norma Jean Mortensen. Her life said no one's child. She was born in Los Angeles, 1926, a city of dreams, but she arrived without one. Her mother, Gladys, was a film cutter for RKO Pictures, intelligent, beautiful, and already unraveling from the edges. Her father was absent, his name changing depending on who you asked. The studios loved the myth that Marilyn was born for the camera, but the truth was far darker. She was born in its shadow. The state took her from Gladys when she was just 7. Foster homes followed 9 in total. At one house, she would lie awake to the sound of the adults arguing in the next room. At another, she learned silence, because silence kept her safe. Her foster mother once told a neighbor, "She doesn't speak much. She just stares at the stars." At 11, she was sent to an orphanage. The matron remembered her as a quiet girl with eyes too old for her age. From those gray walls, Marilyn began to imagine a world where people loved her simply for existing. That imagination would become her survival mechanism and later her curse. When she was 15, she met a neighbor named Jim Doherty, a quiet boy who promised her safety. He married her when she turned 16, not out of romance, but necessity. It was the only way to avoid being sent back to the orphanage. He went off to war. She went to work in a munitions factory, just another girl painting airplane parts until a photographer from the Army's motion picture unit spotted her. He later recalled, "She wasn't posing, she was luminous. Like light found her on purpose." The photograph made its way to a modeling agency. Norma Jean changed her hair, her walk, her voice, and began to disappear into someone new. But the little girl inside her never left. During interviews decades later, she would still talk about standing alone on the sidewalk as a child, pressing her face against the window of a movie theater she couldn't afford to enter. Inside, flickering light danced across perfect faces. She whispered to herself, "Someday they'll know my name." Grafter Paces, her early diary entries, now archived, tell the same story in a trembling hand. "If I can make people love me, I'll never be alone again." That line would haunt every chapter of her life. Her foster sister once said, "She learned how to become whoever people needed her to be. That's how she survived." And survive she did first as a pinup, then as a model, then as an actress. But beneath every transformation lay the same ache, the craving for a stable love that never came. By her early 20s, the transformation was complete. The brown curls became platinum waves. The shy voice became a breathy whisper. The girl with no home had become America's most desired woman. But psychologists who later studied her life pointed out something tragic. Norma Jean didn't create Marilyn Monroe, society did. Every man who looked at her, every camera flash, every headline, reinforced the idea that love and attention were the same thing. So she kept performing love even when it destroyed her. Her acting coach, Natasha Lytis, said, "She wasn't acting in her films. She was trying to heal on screen." That's why her sadness always felt real, because it was. Yet there was something else that made her rise inevitable: intelligence. Though the studios treated her like decoration, she devoured books by Dostoevsky, Freud, and Rilke. She would quote poetry on set, stunning everyone who thought she couldn't read beyond a script. One crew member on The Asphalt Jungle recalled, "She'd finish a take, then start talking about the meaning of existence. Nobody knew what to say." Supporting is Selju and Iridian accelerated. Behind the breathy voice was a mind both sharp and restless, the same mind that would later get her into dangerous rooms, with dangerous men, asking questions she wasn't supposed to ask. But for now, in the quiet of her early fame, she believed she had escaped the ghost of Norma Jean. She had a new name, new life, and a city that finally looked back at her with adoration instead of indifference. Except, every mirror told a different story. Behind the perfect reflection, the cracks were already forming. The lost child had followed her into the spotlight, and sooner or later, the world would see it too. Because even then, before the fame, Before the scandals, Marilyn Monroe's tragedy had already begun. It began the moment she learned that, to be loved, she had to become someone else. Hollywood was not a dreamland when Marilyn entered it. It was a glittering factory that chewed through souls and called it art. When Norma Jean first walked through the gates of 20th Century Fox, she was barely 20. Her heart was thumping like a metronome of hope. She wore a borrowed dress and carried her portfolio in a trembling hand. The receptionist smiled politely, not realizing she was looking at the future face of American desire. Studio scout Ben Lyon remembered that first meeting vividly. She was nervous but radiant. When she smiled, the whole room softened. "I told her your name should be Marilyn Monroe." She repeated it slowly, as if trying on destiny. And destiny fit perfectly, at least from the outside. In those early years, she worked endlessly. Minor roles, extra scenes, endless photo shoots for men's magazines. She learned to stand still for hours, to keep her eyes wide and her lips trembling in that trademark innocence. Behind the lens, photographers called her the girl who made light obey. But off camera, she was just a lonely young woman studying acting late into the night, circling words in her script until the pages tore. Her drama coach, Natasha Lightis, became both mentor and mother figure, and sometimes something darker. She pushed Marilyn brutally, screaming, "You want to be a star? Then bleed for it." And Marilyn did. Every role, every line, every breath, she poured her fear into it. Her first real recognition came with The Asphalt Jungle, 1950, a noir classic where her role was small but unforgettable. Critics wrote, "There's something haunting about that girl. She doesn't act, she exists." That line would follow her forever. Within a year, she was everywhere: posters, calendars, film reels, and the industry began to notice. But fame came with conditions. Put in May prison, studio executives demanded she tone down her brain and turn up her body. A Fox producer once told her, "People don't pay to hear you think, sweetheart. They pay to watch you breathe." Journalists adored her but mocked her too. One magazine headline read, "Can a dumb blonde act smart?" Marilyn laughed in interviews, but cried afterward. She later said, "If I'm going to be treated like a joke, I might as well make it a good one." She played that role, the soft, playful, childlike bombshell, with such precision that the world forgot she was acting. She called it her armor. But armor, no matter how beautiful, still gets heavy. Behind the scenes, Marilyn fought to control her image. She began rejecting photographers who demanded nude shots, insisted on approving her own publicity stills, and secretly enrolled in classes at the Actors Studio in New York under Lee Strasberg, the father of method acting. Her classmates were stunned. They expected the breathy Hollywood caricature. Instead, they found a woman quoting Chekhov, trembling with the need to be taken seriously. Actor Eli Wallach, who shared scenes with her, said years later, "She was a paradox, fragile and fierce at once. Every man wanted to save her, but she didn't want saving. She wanted understanding." By the early 1950 seconds, Marilyn Monroe was no longer just a name. She was a national obsession, the smile that sold a fantasy in a post-war America desperate to feel alive again. She starred in Niagara, 1953, a film dripping with lust and danger. Then came Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and How to Marry a Millionaire, films that cemented her as the ultimate screen siren. Yet the higher she rose, the lonelier she became. Studio gossip claimed she was too emotional, too late, too needy. They called her a diva, but few knew that she was often found in her dressing room, quietly reciting affirmations from Rilke. The purpose of life is to be defeated by greater and greater things. And Hollywood was the greatest of them all. She began attracting powerful men, agents, producers, writers, even presidents. But each saw her through their own lens. As a muse, a conquest, or a secret, no one saw her. One journalist who followed her career from the start said, "Marilyn wasn't a person. She was a headline that learned to breathe." It is the Place with Hell Manor. When she won the Golden Globe for Some Like It Hot, she held the trophy and whispered backstage, "It's funny. They finally call me talented after I almost lost my mind making it." Her co-star Tony Curtis admitted that filming with her was chaos. You never knew which Marilyn would show up, the genius or the ghost. The ghost began to win. Behind the glamour, she was collapsing under the pressure late to sets, trembling on stage, medicated just to sleep. Her doctor, Dr. Greenson, said privately, "She's exhausted by the act of being herself." But what no one realized was that Marilyn was already planning her rebellion. She was tired of being a studio's puppet. She wanted freedom, artistic and personal. She once told a reporter, "If I can't be myself, what's the point of being Marilyn Monroe?" That his fame's enraged him. She ended her contract with 20th Century Fox, started Marilyn Monroe Productions, and began choosing her own scripts. The press called her insane. Hollywood insiders whispered, "No one walks away from Fox and lives to tell about it." They were half right. Her newfound power drew new enemies, studio executives, political figures, and men whose secrets she was beginning to know too well. And as she stepped deeper into those forbidden circles, the dream turned into something else, a surveillance, a silence, a slow suffocation. The world saw a woman at her peak, but those who really watched saw the warning signs: paranoia, insomnia, phone taps, shadows at the gate. It was the beginning of the end and the beginning of the mystery. Because by then, Marilyn wasn't just Hollywood's greatest star. She was its most dangerous witness. By 1956, Marilyn Monroe was not just a movie star, she was a religion. Millions prayed to her image every time they opened a magazine or sat in a darkened theater. Her lips, her voice, her walk each became sacred icons of post-war desire. Yet behind that radiance, something hollow was echoing. Those close to her began noticing it. Her acting coach, Lee Strasberg, said, "When Marilyn walked into a room, she carried light with her. But when she left, the light stayed because it wasn't hers." She was living two lives: Marilyn Monroe, the world's fantasy, and Norma Jean, the lonely woman who spent nights reading poetry in an empty bedroom. Fame had split her in two, and the gap between them grew wider each year. Still, this was her golden age. The 7-year itch, Some Like It Hot, Bus Stop, The Prince and the Showgirl, each performance more magnetic than the last. Critics began admitting what they had denied for years. She wasn't just beautiful, she was brilliant. The New York Times wrote, "She has evolved beyond her image. There's pain behind the glamour, and it makes her hypnotic." The irony was brutal. The more real she became, the less real her world felt. In 1956, she married playwright Arthur Miller, the intellectual giant of American theater. To her fans, it was a fairy tale. Beauty and brains, the goddess and the genius. But those who knew them said otherwise. Miller's close friend remembered. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a muse. And she wanted someone to save her. Their home in Connecticut was elegant but cold. Marilyn filled it with candles, soft colors, and photographs of her late mother. She told a friend, "I thought I'd finally found peace, but all I did was decorate another cage." In the Grapses to the Wanago, as Miller wrote The Misfits, for her a film meant to show her depth, he also began writing in his diary about his disappointment. Marilyn discovered the entries by accident. One line shattered her. "I'm embarrassed by her childishness in front of my friends." She would later say, "That's when I realized even love can humiliate you." While her marriage was crumbling, her fame soared to an unbearable height. She became a global symbol of lust and loneliness. Soldiers carried her photos into battle. Presidents invited her to dinner. Journalists followed her like pilgrims. But behind the flashbulbs, she was spiraling, medicated by barbiturates, numbed by champagne, suffocating beneath the weight of her image. Her personal doctor, Dr. Engelberg, later confessed she didn't want to die. She wanted the pain to stop. That censor-safe quarter to General Krabel, Hollywood insiders began whispering about her connection to powerful men, especially one whose name could not appear in print, John F. Kennedy. She met him in 1961 at a party hosted by Peter Lawford, and the chemistry was instant. Witnesses say Marilyn looked at him with the same mixture of awe and danger she once reserved for fame itself. A White House aide later admitted, "They called her the most beautiful security risk in America." By then, FBI files were quietly documenting her movements. Wiretaps, phone logs, surveillance notes. The Bureau feared she might leak sensitive information, not because she was malicious, but because she was emotional. She confided too much, too easily. To friends, she said, "I'm tired of being treated like a secret that everyone knows." Then came Madison Square Garden, 1962. President Kennedy's birthday celebration. Marilyn, draped in a dress so tight it had to be sewn onto her, stepped out of the shadows and whispered into the microphone, "Happy birthday, Mr. President." It wasn't a performance. It was a moment of forbidden electricity, one that shook the White House and forever sealed her fate. That night, among the applause and champagne, eyes were watching political aides, intelligence officers, Hollywood fixers. Within weeks, phone calls between Marilyn and the Kennedys were cut off. Her friends reported men in dark suits near her home. Her maid said the phone clicked every time she lifted the receiver. She became paranoid, but with reason. Her psychiatrist noted her anxiety. She believes her home is being watched. She's correct. Hollywood dismissed her as hysterical. The press mocked her as unstable. But behind the curtain, she was being silenced, not by scandal, but by fear. Her final film, Something's Gotta Give, began production in 1962. She was fragile, arriving late, trembling through her lines. The studio fired her mid-shoot. A week later, they begged her back. The box office couldn't survive without her. But the damage was done. Her reputation was in ruins. In her final interview, recorded weeks before her death, Marilyn said quietly, "I've been hurt by people who taught me to smile." Those who saw her in those last months recall a woman fading at the edges. The studio saw her as insurance liability. Her friends saw her as unreachable. And the men who once adored her, some in the highest offices of power, began pretending they'd never met her. The world saw glamour. She saw shadows. Every photograph from that summer glows with the strange beauty of a dying star, the light burning hottest before it disappears. Because Marilyn Monroe, in her final days, wasn't just a woman at her peak. She was a truth too dangerous to exist. And soon, the world would be forced to choose between remembering her or erasing her. It was a quiet Saturday night in Brentwood, August 4th, 1962. The air was thick and unnaturally still, the kind of silence that feels staged. Inside 12305 Fifth Helena Drive, Marilyn Monroe, Hollywood's brightest star, was alone, or so the official story said. The timeline that followed would become one of the most disputed in American history. Every clock ticked differently depending on who you asked. Every witness contradicted the next. And yet, all of them were telling the truth or their version of it. At 3:25 a.m., the LAPD received a call. Sergeant Jack Clemens arrived minutes later and stepped into the dim bedroom. He found Marilyn on the bed, nude, face down, one arm stretched toward the telephone as if frozen mid-reach. Empty pill bottles were perfectly lined on the nightstand, too perfect, he thought. He would later swear under oath. It looked staged. She didn't look like a suicide. She looked placed. The housekeeper, Eunice Murray, met him at the door in a robe, strangely calm. Her story changed each time she told it. First, she said she noticed a light under Marilyn's door at midnight. Then, she said it was 3 a.m. Then, she said Dr. Greenson told her to call the police only after everything was taken care of. Dr. Ralph Greenson, her psychiatrist, arrived soon after. He claimed he broke a window to enter the locked room. But Clemens noted the glass was shattered outward, not inward. A detail that should have changed everything but was buried in the report. And then there was the ambulance driver, James Hall. In an interview years later, he said something chilling. "She was alive when we got there, barely breathing. They told us to take her to the hospital, but Dr. Greenson said no, that she needed to stay." Hall's partner backed him up. No one listened. The coroner's report ruled it probable suicide by overdose, but fragments of the story refused to align. No water glass was found by the bed. How could she swallow over 40 pills? No residue of barbiturates was found in her stomach, suggesting injection, not ingestion. And the toxicology report vanished before it could be reviewed. Neighbors reported seeing men in dark suits outside the house earlier that evening. One claimed he heard shouting around 10 p.m., then a car door slam. Another said she saw a black limousine parked near the gate hours before police arrived. But it was what the investigators found later that turned suspicion into dread. Her phone records for that night erased. Her diary missing. Her last calls gone. The FBI file labeled MM Personal, still classified in part to this day. Those closest to her began to whisper the same unthinkable thought. Peter Lawford, brother-in-law to President Kennedy, received a call from Marilyn hours before she died. She sounded disoriented. He recalled her saying, "Say goodbye to the president and say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy." When he tried to call back, the line was dead. Her friend and acting coach, Paula Strasberg, insisted Marilyn was not suicidal that week. She was planning new projects and even discussing adopting a child. Paula said, "She told me she was finally free from the studios and she wanted to start over. This hair, collusions, freedom, perhaps the most dangerous thing a woman like her could have." Then came the whispers that she had kept letters, phone tapes, and recordings of private conversations with both Kennedys, that she had threatened to expose them during a press conference scheduled the following Monday. The FBI had her home under wiretap. CIA analysts monitored her calls. J. Edgar Hoover had a full dossier on her labeled political security risk. A former FBI agent later stated, "She knew things that could have changed the administration. That made her expendable." Her autopsy was conducted under the supervision of the very officials whose reputations depended on silence. The organs that could confirm barbiturate injection, her kidneys, liver, and stomach, were accidentally destroyed before secondary testing. The pathologist in charge resigned shortly after. When Sergeant Clemens tried to reopen the case months later, he was told by his superiors, "Leave it alone, it's bigger than you." And so, the myth was born. The lonely woman, the overdose, the tragedy of fame. Hollywood exhaled in relief. The headlines were written before sunrise. Marilyn Monroe dead at 36. The public wept, the studios mourned, and the truth was quietly sealed in government vaults. But fragments kept escaping. In 1982, the LAPD conducted a new review of the case. They found evidence of multiple phone taps and secret recordings of her final conversations. Still, they called it inconclusive. The file was closed again. And perhaps that's what she had become, not a person, but a file. A classified memory that could never be reopened without tearing apart the illusion of innocence surrounding the powerful men she once trusted. Her housekeeper died decades later, still changing her story. Her doctor fell into obscurity, refusing interviews. Peter Lawford drank himself into silence. And the legend of Marilyn Monroe continued, beautiful, tragic, perfectly unfinished. Because the greatest secret about her death isn't who killed her. It's why they needed her gone. She had become more than an actress, more than a lover, more than an icon. She had become the one thing Hollywood and Washington feared most, a woman who knew the truth and was finally ready to speak it. In the weeks before her death, Marilyn Monroe lived inside a strange calm, the kind that comes before a storm that already knows its destination. She had moved back into her Brentwood home, a modest Spanish-style bungalow surrounded by white roses. Her neighbors said she seemed lighter. She walked barefoot in the garden, fed her dog Math, and spoke about redecorating. To the world, it looked like recovery. But recovery is a fragile disguise. She had been fired and rehired by 20th Century Fox. The studio begged her to finish Something's Got to Give. She told friends she planned to renegotiate her contract. "They'll see," she said. "I'm not their puppet anymore." Her makeup artist, Alan Whitey Snyder, noticed a new determination. She was sober, sharp, tired of being a joke. But her psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson, told a different story. He warned she was emotionally unstable and insisted she continue daily therapy sessions, often at his home, sometimes even late at night. Friends began to suspect she wasn't being treated. She was being monitored. Her maid, Eunice Murray, later confessed. There were always people calling, watching, taking notes. She said she couldn't trust the phone. By that summer, Marilyn had started cutting ties with almost everyone. Her studio, her lovers, even the Kennedys. She told journalist Richard Merriman during her last interview for Life magazine, "I don't belong to anyone now, not to Hollywood, not to a man. I just want to be free." But freedom, for Marilyn, had always come with a cost. On August 3rd, she spoke to several friends. Hairdresser Sidney Gilaroff said she sounded upbeat, excited about new scripts. Her publicist Pat Newcomb remembered her saying, "Next week will be different. I can feel it." That evening, she spent hours on the phone with her ex-husband Joe DiMaggio, who had recently re-entered her life. He later said she sounded hopeful. They were planning to remarry. He ordered fresh roses to be delivered to her door every Monday, forever. The next night, everything stopped. Between 7 and 8 p.m., Peter Lawford called from his beach house. He heard her slurring words, sounding distressed. He said, "Marilyn, you're worrying me. You sound like you're in trouble." She replied, "Say goodbye to Pat. Say goodbye to the president. Say goodbye to yourself, because you're a nice guy." Then the line went dead. What happened in the hours after remains one of Hollywood's darkest riddles. Dr. Greenson arrived before midnight. He claimed he found her door locked, broke the window, and discovered her body. But multiple witnesses swore that light still glowed under her bedroom door at 3 a.m. When the police were finally called at 4:25 a.m., her body had already been moved. Sheets changed. Evidence rearranged. The paramedics who arrived later said she was still warm, barely breathing. One of them, James Hall, said in a taped interview, "We were told to wait. The doctor said she couldn't be moved." Then, a few minutes later, she was gone. Her diary, filled with names and phone numbers of powerful men, vanished from the scene. The lockbox that held her notes was empty. Neighbors remembered hearing helicopters that night and then silence. By dawn, the official story had been written. Actress Marilyn Monroe, found dead, apparent overdose. The headlines focused on the pills, the loneliness, the fading star. Not one mentioned the phone taps, the political connections, the missing diary. The funeral was small, private, and eerily quiet. Joe DiMaggio handled every detail himself. He banned most of Hollywood from attending, whispering, "They killed her." He sent roses to her grave 3 times a week for 20 years. And yet, for all its mystery, Marilyn's final chapter felt tragically predictable. She had spent her entire life trying to control her own story, only to have others rewrite it after she was gone. The orphan, the goddess, the muse, the scandal, all crafted by men who needed her to be something she never was. But in the end, she became something they could never control, a legend that refused to die. Because death only ended her life. The truth that still lives, hidden between the lies that built her. In the decades that followed her death, Marilyn Monroe became less of a woman and more of a question. Not who she was, but what she meant. To the dreamers, she remained the eternal muse, the glow of the silver screen preserved in amber. To the cynics, she was the cautionary tale of fame devouring its own. But to those who looked closely, she became something much larger. A mirror reflecting the contradictions of a culture that worships beauty and punishes vulnerability. Photographs of her began to take on the quality of relics. Andy Warhol's iconic silkscreen turned her into modern sainthood, a pop martyr in Technicolor. Students wrote theses about her loneliness. Feminists debated her. Was she victim or architect of her own myth? Scholar Gloria Steinem once wrote, "Marilyn lived out the fantasy of every man and the fear of every woman." Hollywood, for its part, tried to clean the blood from the story. The studios sold her films again, polishing her name as if grief were a marketing tool. They called her timeless. They never called her exploited. Meanwhile, the rumors refused to rest. Biographers uncovered FBI files, secret White House logs, and destroyed autopsy samples, evidence that something had been covered up, though no one could prove what. The uncertainty became part of her legend. Every generation rediscovers her. In the 1,970 seconds, she was reborn as the tragic muse of post-feminist longing. In the 1,980 seconds, as the fragile pop icon plastered on dorm walls and album covers. In the 2000s, as a meme of perfection no one could live up to. And now, she exists in pixels and clips, smiling forever, a moving ghost whose pain has been remastered in 4K. Writers who interviewed the people closest to her noticed a strange pattern. None of them spoke of her as dead. They used the present tense Marilyn is, not was, as if her energy still haunts every lens that tries to capture desire. Actors still mimic her breathy tone. Fashion houses still steal her silhouette. Her image still sells everything from perfume to sadness. Yet the woman behind it all remains missing, buried under the glitter she never asked for. What's most haunting is how modern her story feels. A young woman raised by chaos, devoured by celebrity, medicated into silence, and dismissed as unstable when she tried to fight back. She could be anyone today, a singer, an influencer, an actress smiling through burnout. The machinery hasn't changed. Only the lights have. One of her last notebooks held a line scribbled in pencil. "I want to be wonderful. I want to be real." That contradiction became her eternity, the impossible balance between performance and truth. Filmmaker Billy Wilder, who directed her in Some Like It Hot, said years later, "There was only one Marilyn. The rest of us were just trying to figure out how to film the light she carried. Is no one down the white? Is erupting bug? But maybe that light was never meant for cameras. Maybe it was meant to blind us long enough to see the cost of what we call fame. Because every time the world revives her in documentaries, art, gossip, it's really confessing something about itself, that we still don't know how to love a woman without destroying her first. And perhaps that is Marilyn Monroe's true legacy, not beauty, not fame, not tragedy, but the mirror she left behind, forcing us to look at who built her and who buried her. When the story of Marilyn Monroe is told, it often begins with beauty and ends with death. But that version, the Hollywood version, is a performance, the same illusion that built her and broke her. At Celebrity Forgotten, we believe her tragedy was never about weakness. It was about power, who had it, who lost it, and who was punished for wanting it. Marilyn Monroe was not simply a victim of fame. She was one of the few who tried to own it. She challenged studios when actresses were still expected to obey. She demanded to be paid equally, to be respected, to be heard, and the moment she did, they called her unstable. That word, used so casually, has buried more women than time ever could. People often say she was naive, but the record shows something different. Her letters reveal a woman who studied philosophy, wrote poetry, and questioned everything around her. She once said, "The truth is, I've never fooled anyone. They all fooled themselves to see in me what they wanted." It's hard to call that naivete. That's clarity. From the outside, her world looked like paradise: champagne, diamonds, premieres. But from the inside, it was a maze with no exit. The pills weren't escape, they were armor. The laughter wasn't joy, it was camouflage. Marilyn lived in a time when silence was expected, and she died the moment she refused it. And yet, there's another version of this story, one whispered in the corridors of history. A version where Marilyn didn't die from loneliness or despair, but from knowing too much. Where she was silenced not for being fragile, but for being dangerous. Was it the government, the studios, or the men she loved who feared her truth? Maybe all of them. Maybe none. The mystery remains because power prefers its ghosts beautiful and mute. But maybe that's what makes Marilyn's legacy so haunting. Even in death, she forced the world to confront what it does to women who dare to be both intelligent and desired. She made vulnerability revolutionary, and she made tragedy unforgettable. The saddest part? The system that destroyed her still exists. It just wears new clothes, social media instead of studios, headlines instead of gossip columns, digital applause instead of movie tickets. Every generation has its Marilyn, the woman adored, dissected, and devoured in the name of love. Perhaps the real question isn't how she died. It's why the world keeps needing her to die over and over just to feel alive again. And so we look back not to mourn, but to remember. To remember that behind the diamonds and the whispers was a woman who wanted only one thing: to be seen as real. Because in the end, Marilyn Monroe's greatest performance wasn't in a film. It was surviving the gaze of the entire world until she couldn't. There's a moment, if you stand long enough at her grave in Westwood Cemetery, when the world goes quiet, the traffic fades, the wind softens, and the marble plaque seems to breathe with the weight of everything unsaid. Visitors leave roses, lipstick marks, letters, all of them addressed to someone who stopped reading 6 decades ago. But somehow, she still answers, because Marilyn Monroe never truly left. She exists in fragments, a laugh echoing through an old movie reel, a photograph flickering in a museum, a rumor whispered between strangers who never met her. She is both memory and myth, as alive in imagination as she ever was in flesh. If you watch closely, her story plays like an unfinished film, frames missing, dialogue cut, the ending rewritten by those who needed her to stay silent. And yet the camera still lingers. On that last smile, that last look, that last call unanswered. In every age, there are those who claim to have solved her mystery, but maybe it was never meant to be solved, only understood. Because behind every theory, every document, every conspiracy, lies a simpler truth. A woman once wanted to be loved, and the world mistook her for a symbol. A child of abandonment who became the most seen and most unseen person in the world. A goddess built from vulnerability. A star who burned too brightly in a sky that didn't know how to hold her. Her home in Brentwood still stands. New owners, fresh paint, the tiles replaced. But if walls remember, those walls remember the voice that once said softly, "Please don't make me a joke." They remember the sound of a phone falling to the floor. They remember the silence that followed a silence the world has been trying to fill ever since. So maybe Marilyn's story isn't a tragedy. Maybe it's a mirror, one that forces us to ask why brilliance must so often bleed for beauty. She came from nothing, gave everything, and left behind a mystery that still glows like static on an old screen. And perhaps that's why we keep watching her, not because we understand her, but because deep down, we recognize ourselves in her reflection. Somewhere between Norma Jean and Marilyn Monroe lies the truth we were never meant to find. A truth that still haunts Hollywood's golden light. A truth that still whispers through every photograph, every lie, every frame of a dream too bright to survive. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now,